Is that I'm meant to finish speaking at 10:45 and it's now after 10:45, so I have to pause time or rewind the clock. So I'll just basically speak as fast as I can. I think probably to kind of try and accelerate things forward, I'll cut out a lot of what I was going to say, which is implied by the title of the presentation. The title is Agency and Transitions, an Agent-Based Social Simulation Perspective. So what I probably won't have time to do is talk much about agent-based modelling. What I thought might be quite nice, and we can talk maybe later on if anyone's interested in this, what I'll do is I'll use a concrete example of what we're creating an agent-based model to simulate. But first, an agent-based model and a model, and all models that we build as social scientists, as management scientists, as any kind of like scientists, what we do is we create representations of things that are out there in the real world, but we simplify. All of our equation-based models in economics are simplifications of reality. So what I'm talking about here is the world of a person as experienced. So a simulated world, here we have a person at home represented by a red box. That person's got a car, and also a workplace that's associated with their life. Here's where the PowerPoint skills come in. So that person kind of goes to work every day, but obviously that's too simple, so they've got colleagues that they work with, and at the end of the day, the person goes home in their car. It worked, excellent. Right, so that's good. And then all these other people obviously have other respective homes to go to. So then we build up a gradually more complicated picture of the world. So all of our models that we build as scientists, we have to be aware of what simplifications we're making. But we know that that's far too simple. That's not an adequate representation of a model of a person's life. We need to build up a more adequate description of the context. So we gradually build up more and more. What happens, we've got not just one workplace in any kind of geography, we've got lots of different workplaces represented by the blue boxes here. There's schools that are provided for education for children. So the people here with children are likely to have the children going to schools. There's different sizes of households, sizes of houses, and there's different numbers of cars that people have. You could keep going with the complexity, but already that's only adding about 2 or 3 different attributes to this kind of model. But it already is feeling slightly more complicated, and watch this. So there's more people kind of like wandering around and all going to work. This guy's just going for a ride in his car. So my point here is that we have to realize how simple even quite complicated looking models are. Now the green people, if you saw them here, they lived in this house here. They were the only people in that particular running around PowerPoint thing that didn't take their children to school. The child walked themselves to school. And that was a representation of a decision that the green parents had made not to necessarily walk their child to school, because the child was obviously just deemed to be old enough to walk to school, or something like that. So there is a link between all that and what I'm talking about here. Now, what I'll do very quickly is say what we're doing in the GLAMRS project, looking at a flexible working policy, basically. So what we have in GLAMRS is we have a city regional perspective that we're looking at people who work in the 2 local authorities in the region. Now, the local authorities are very large employers in the region. Aberdeen Shire Council, as an example, employs about 14,000 people. So there's a lot of people and lots of different offices around the region. So there's a sizable case study that we've got there. There are 2 workplace initiatives that we're focusing on here with a specific focus on flexible working. Flexible working is changes in the location or the time, basically, of when work occurs. They're called Work Smart or Smarter Working, which is a play on the same words. There's multiple outcomes of flexible working policies. There's lots of literature about this in the management literature. Lots of discussion about the future of work and how technology is going to enable all sorts of different models of working. And a lot of this is extremely positive kind of looking stuff. We can enable a greater work-life balance in families and individuals. And we can reduce commuting miles in aggregate. And from an organizational perspective, there can be a lowering of direct organizational energy bills. If you need a lower size of facility in order to house all of the workers that you have in a particular organization, then heating and lighting bills go down. However, saying that, if you require people to work from home in order to lower your direct energy bills, it also requires that the heating and the lighting is distributed around regions, in people's houses or somewhere else. But there are challenges to flexible working and these kind of policies. One of the ones that comes up again and again in the conversations that we've had, we've done some focus groups and interviews around this kind of issue, is hot desking. Hot desking is a logical consequence of needing to kind of shrink workspace. So the micro territory of the desk and the office goes. And people in different ways are often quite wedded to their micro territory of their office environment. And I would put my hand up and say that I'm one of them. I like my desk. I like the fact I've got my shelves with my books on, and I've got a door I can close. But I don't know that I'm born compared to many people who work in open plan environments who don't have a desk. They don't have anywhere to put their stuff and all that rubbish that's in my drawers. So that's something that comes up again and again, but not for everyone. I'm not saying that hot desking is a bad policy. I'm saying there's a very hard transition that some people have to make when they go down that line. When people arrive at work, one of the other problems that came up in the discussions that we had, when people arrive at work, sometimes they don't know where they're going to be, to the extent, they don't even know what floor in an office, a big block office environment they're going to be on. And that's not only important in terms of knowing where your desk is, it's important in terms of knowing where your colleagues are. So if you have a team in an organization and you're wanting to kind of have that kind of informal socializing that is a necessary part of work, it's very important to know where your colleagues are. If you have a question that you have to ask one of your team members, not being able to know when you go in the door where that person is likely to be, is it extremely inefficient because it means you have to walk around the whole building because there's no way of logging onto a computer to check where someone is until you have a desk. So it's one of these kind of like unforeseen consequences of this kind of policy. It's not insurmountable, but it's interesting how these kind of dynamics occur. And as I said, there are many individual differences. It's not the case that everyone loves this kind of like policy, or it's not the case that everyone hates it. Most people explain that they like the benefits of flexibility of working, but there are things that they don't like. Usually the one that comes up is about hot desking. There's issues to do with hygiene, to do with people kind of not wiping their keyboards and their phones and having kind of crumbs from biscuits and stuff left on the desk. That can cause a problem, and it can cause a lot of distress for people. So these kind of things are organizational issues that need to be dealt with by the facilities manager. Anyway, that's all the context of what we're looking at. So we're doing lots of research on that, and it'll be great. It's really interesting, and I love it as a case study. Now, what I thought I would explain here, though, is a quick link back to is a previous European project. Nikki was involved in the Aberdeenshire Council round called the Music Project. It wasn't a research project; it was more of a local authority-led project. And what this was looking at, it was a transition management project. What this was looking at was getting a load of people, a load of local stakeholders around the table to look at transitioning to a sustainable future in the local region. One of the discussion groups of the various stakeholders that came out of this process was called the Remote Working Hubs Experimental Project. Now this linked completely with our case study. So, we'll have this as well then. Because Aberdeen City Council and Aberdeen Shire Council and various other public sector organisations, including my own organisation, were around this table to discuss a very simple idea, which was basically, can we utilise workspace that is closer to where people live, which is not being used when work occurs, whenever that may be? So what we've done is we ran 2 trial days as part of this very small pilot project, where we basically got some people from different organisations to come together and work in a particular place that wasn't being used. The 2 places that we used was a library, a college library in the summer holidays, and a school staff room. The school staff room is where basically the teachers go at lunchtime or at the beginning of the day. The rest of the time it sits empty. That was much harder to organise. The logistics of organising this kind of thing was quite hard, but it was interesting. not because we thought this was an ideal environment, but because we could see what kind of problems people had. And the big problems, no big surprise here, was physical building security, getting in the building at the end of the day for people from different organizations, and virtual security. Basically, logging onto the wireless network was a big problem. So this is that's the case that I'm looking at, and we're looking at these things within an agent-based modeling perspective. I'm now out of time, so I'm not going to, I think I'm out of time, I'm not going to speak about agent-based modeling, but I'll say that we are making agent-based modeling simulations, which is essentially like a Petri dish experiment for a virtual computer environment. That'll do. Relating quickly back to some of the discussion yesterday about agency, because that's what I was really wanting to speak about here. Agency within a computer simulation is very different often than our conceptions of agency. Agency from a computer scientific perspective is something that's ascribed to an entity within the model by the fact that a process is occurring that makes a change in the virtual world happen from time n to time n plus delta. That's a stuff. We're building an agent-based modeling, and it's called DIREC. My colleagues Gary Polhill and Jati Ge will be kind of building that model, and they have far more expertise than I do in this kind of stuff because I'm a psychologist. So, finally, what I would like to finish on is this idea of agency within an agent-based model. We're building these models, which are essentially like my PowerPoint ridiculous thing where people kind of like running around in it, but far more complicated than that, but as simple as we can make them. Dennett, a philosopher from the 1970s, asked, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for agency? And Dennett also has this idea of the intentional stance, the idea that, and how that relates to agent-based modeling is, does a computer agent-based model need to take an intentional stance? Do we have to believe that a virtual person or agent within a model has intentionality? Now, Bandura, who Adina mentioned yesterday, says that the four conditions for human agency are intentionality, forethought, self-reactiveness, and self-reflectiveness. So my question to the floor here is, if an agent-based model, a computer simulation model, or a wee person on PowerPoint, does not explicitly represent such attributes as part of an agent, can it really be said to have agency? And I'm just asking for feedback on that particular question, because when we go and build, or when as a team, we build agent-based models, we have to be clear what position we're taking on agency. And I feel that that's something that we don't debate enough, because when we look at the results, and this isn't just about agent-based models, this is about models in general. When we take the results of our models and then we give them meaning as scientists, we should consider first our position on agency and how much we should believe our models are actually telling us. So I was just wanting your thoughts on that question. Asbjørn?
Alex, and then Alex switch.
So I'll follow up on that directly, to go back to that slide.
Yep.
What is your feeling about the ability to model each of those four attributes in an agent-based model?
Well,
do you have a strategy for each of those?
Well, I'm not an agent-based modeler. I'm the psychologist on the team in Aberdeen. So I think there are computational algorithms that have attempted to model various forms of intentionality. From what I gather, from the 1980s kind of onwards. In terms of the other ones, I honestly can't answer that because this is a psychological perspective that I'm putting here. I think there are probably synthetic versions of things that would look like each of these. Whether we would believe them to be so was my question.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me the self-reflectiveness is the most difficult one. That's the agents being reflexive can lead to them doing extraordinary things.
Yeah.
And that's, it seems to me, would be the hardest to put into a model, because the model the agent-based model, as I understand it, must implicitly constrain structures. Well, the agent-based model, however you implement it, it's going to embody a whole load of assumptions about structures and the ability of structures to change.
Yep.
So it'd be quite a sophisticated agent-based model that linked self-reflectiveness of agents to the ability to transform structures.
Well, no, I agree. I agree completely. I mean, and as you know, I mean, agent-based models are very often much simpler than a drawing of reality. In a sense, it has to be kind of as parsimonious as possible. But from a theoretical point of view, I was kind of thinking, well, what are the limits in a world of kind of ever increasing computability? What is theoretically possible? And this is kind of going back to, I suppose, Turing said something about, when do we know that something's actually a computer or a human being? So in a sense, we're kind of on that same question of, what's theoretically possible. It's a more philosophical question, I guess, than what is... I couldn't answer the question about what is possible from a computing perspective, because it would take an extremely sophisticated model and therefore a team of modelers to do it. But there's incredibly sophisticated software that's out there doing incredibly sophisticated models. So I guess it's a question of ambition, resources, and all these other things. But whether we believe it to be what we think we're building, that's a different question, I think. I know it doesn't really answer your question, but you get my point.
I do. Yeah. And it isn't just about, the conclusion isn't just that you'd have to make a hugely complicated model. It is about what you choose to put into the model, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
How you choose to simplify the world. But there's an interesting point in the context of this meeting we're having about linking the ability of individual agents to reflect with the ability of a model to capture changes in systems and structures.
Yeah.
And there's no reason, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to design a model that can capture that. Any change in structures that you can imagine, you can code into a model.
Changes in structures and the context within which a person is, I don't think that's problematic at all. It's the individual. It's the issue of human agency, I think, could be problematic. It's not problematic from an agent-based modeling point of view, as far as I understand from the agent-based modelers, because the idea from an agent-based modeling perspective of agency is at a much higher level. The network connectability between different entities, that somehow encompasses agency from a computing perspective, but from a psychological perspective, I don't personally, and I think my co-authors will actually disagree on this point, I don't think that does make sense. I think human agency is something that's human. But
I suggest that self-reflectiveness assumes some kind of cognitive processing and can be operationalized as an attitude scale in the psychosocial perspective. That can be modeled within a theoretical approach in an agent-based model. Mm-hmm. Well, I suggest as a way of you are talking about the difficulties to what self-reflectiveness is in the context of an agency, in the context of social behavior. But I think psychologists have been doing this, following the Fishbein and Achten theory for explaining social behavior, operationalizing in a scale format of attitudes.
I mean, I agree on that one. I mean, getting the starting point of the model, there are good measures for all these things. Mm-hmm. The issue is the dynamics of the model once you run it. So in a sense, we can get people to fill in questionnaires and parameterize the model with ever more sophisticated kind of like tools of data collection. But how do we get the virtual agents to fill in virtual questionnaires every day and then know what the dynamics are? We have done some work looking at using decision trees to sort of do that kind of stuff, but it's really hard, but it's cool.
Richard?
I think my question's actually been maybe answered 4 or 5 times over, but maybe you're a reviewer of one of my papers right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe. We're having a bit of so I'll lay this out as a comment because it relates real strongly to what we're talking about here. We're having a bit of a go-round with some folks at an unnamed journal where we're doing an agent-based model simulation, and I think from the standpoint of the agent-based modeling software being ahead of the assumptions, I think I think you're right. I think the software, my understanding, at least my naive understanding of the software, is that we can get the software to do almost anything we want it to do. But the critique, where we're going back and forth with the reviewers, is they're basically saying, look, you have reasonable assumptions about how humans are going to behave at the starting point of your model, sort of at the baseline, but they're saying there are no empirical results to support how it is that those sort of next rounds of simulation are going to work. And so they're basically saying, well, then you can't really use agent-based modeling if you don't have the empirical data to populate what those next steps are going to look like. And we're coming back saying, well, we thought that was sort of how it was supposed to work from the sense of the simulation. And so they're basically, it seems as though they're not really believing in the secondary simulation type steps. And so I wonder if you have any comment on that.
No, that's interesting. I'm not, that was said review, and that certainly wasn't the point that I was making. It's just that if we're wanting to kind of like believe our models more and more, then we need to validate them as much as possible with data. And the starting point of a model obviously is one of the most important things. All models are kind of like, fixed at the starting point. But no, I agree. I mean, many of the models, most of them that I've certainly been involved in the team that we've run, have been very much the same. That they've had a set of parameterization kind of steps that basically, and then you fix the dynamics of the model, sometimes based on some of the relationships between the constructs, say in a questionnaire or something like that. And it's completely reasonable to say, well, this is what we believe. But at the point at which, that was my point, at the point at which you run a model, you have to be comfortable by saying, this is what we believe about the way the world works. And I think sometimes, and this isn't a point about agent-based modeling, this is a point about all of our models. When we have a linear model, a structural equation model, or whatever we're using, we're taking a position on the world that we believe that for every increment of X, something happens to Y or Z. And I think sometimes we forget the logical consequences of believing what we're saying. And I think an agent-based model is kind of threatening in its simplicity because it lays it all out there and it makes this kind of comment happen. Say, well, you haven't measured everything in every year. Of course you've not. You would need endless resources to do that. Whereas an agent-based model or any kind of like simulation model, it's efficient. It's a way of telling a story with far less resources than doing a questionnaire every 10 seconds. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I agree with that particular.
Thank you.
If we're recording this, maybe I can jot this down later for my response to the viewer. That would be
Thank you, Tony. We'll continue with the.